You probably clicked on this video thinking that we were going to be trying on 500 years of maternity fashion. Well, guess what? Most women's clothing was maternity clothing. So before we jump into things, I just want to make a little bit of a disclaimer. Firstly, in this video, we're going to be talking about very sensitive subjects related to infant mortality and unfortunately about misc as well. So if it is something that is very triggering for you or is very upsetting for you, I would not recommend watching this video and clicking off now. Additionally, because we are talking about women throughout history, this video is going to include extremely gendered language due to the fact that we're talking about people in the past. Without further ado, let's jump into things. So hi, Kass.
Hi, how are you doing?
Good. Welcome back to the channel. You want to briefly tell everyone who you are?
I'm Kass McGann. I'm the owner of Reconstructing History Patterns. I'm a clothing historian. I've been working as a clothing historian for 20 years. We're here today to talk about maternity clothing through the ages.
Just a little spoiler, neither of us is pregnant.
Yeah, two not pregnant women talking about maternity clothing.
Maternity clothing is a fascinating subject that I think there are a lot of misconceptions surrounding. Why not talk to a fashion historian about the actual reality of what it might have been like for women?
I don't have children, so I've never been pregnant. However, I get a lot of questions from my customers and visitors to my website throughout the years about, oh, I'm pregnant and I want to continue reenacting, but I don't know what to wear. What did they wear when they were pregnant? The shocking answer is the same thing they wore every other day.
In the 21st century, it's hard for us to imagine that that would be the case because our experience is so incredibly different. As we're going to find out throughout this video, there are reasons why most clothing for women was maternity clothing.
There's a statistic that I want to hit you with right up front because it's very important to understand why this was the case. There's a book called Women's Work by Elizabeth Wayland Barber, and wonderful book. It's one of the first books I read in 1995 that got me interested in the study of clothing. And she reveals in this book the average shirt or tunic, whatever man's upper body garment, took about 4 years of a woman's spare time to make. And that's spinning, weaving, sewing. So 4 years that she wasn't cooking and cleaning and taking care of children and in childbirth and all those things. And the average shirt lasts about 4 years. We don't think about this modernly, how very labor intensive it is to make clothing before the modern era. It's not that you simply weren't rich enough to afford a maternity wardrobe. It's that no one was. And also, you were pregnant so often, why would you have different clothing?
It would have just been like any other day for them, really.
Women's clothing isn't only good for maternity, it's also good for you lose weight, you gain weight, you get older. Women's clothing has to be malleable and your clothing has to fit. When we're talking about a pre-modern time period, you have one set of clothing and it has to fit you through all the changes.
Let's start with the year 1420. What was going on in fashion in the 1400s? Why would you say it would qualify as maternity clothing?
If you look at the silhouettes in art in the 1400s, there's no better example that I can give you than the Arnolfini portrait by Jan van Eyck. And this is a portrait that many people who don't know the time period or who aren't familiar with art think that the woman in the painting is pregnant. She's not pregnant. It's a betrothal picture. She is not yet married to this man. And there's a lot of symbolism showing his wealth, her family's wealth, their devotion to each other. But one of the things that is not symbolic is the dress that she's wearing. It is a beautiful, rich dress. It shows that she comes from a very wealthy background and she can afford this luxurious fabric. However, the way that she's holding it in front of herself, this volume of fabric, and the fact that it fits her breast area, and then it's huge from there on down. If she were pregnant, we wouldn't know. It's not meant to hide pregnancy. It's meant to imitate pregnancy, because a pregnant woman, a pregnant wife, is a prosperous wife. All women's clothing from this time period is very voluminous. Even the clothing of common people, fitted over the shoulders and into the bust area, but very voluminous below. You would look pregnant even when you weren't. We have pictures of people picking crops in the field where they're wearing not quite as voluminous clothing, but they are wearing clothing that is not tight around their waistlines. And we have a wonderful bunch of extant garments called the Greenland finds that were found in Herlufnes, Greenland in the 1920s. These garments are an amazing record of what was worn in the 15th century by normal people. Every single one of the garments that's been identified as a female garment has a gore that starts just under the bust line and flares out. None of them have a waist seam. Some of them have a more tapered waist than others, but there's not a single one of them that you couldn't go through at least 8 months of pregnancy and not have it be tight. The idea that you would have different clothing when you were pregnant, well, you didn't need it.
What was the style of this specific gown called? Did it have a specific name?
The noble people's garment was called a hupalans, but the common people's garment, I mean, this is just kirtle, dress, coat, whatever language you're speaking, it means dress. But yeah, the hupalans was the big voluminous garment and meant to show off your wealth by the fact that you could afford this much fabric. The Greenland finds, these are people who couldn't afford the extra fabric, and yet they're still making clothing that has that kind of A-line shape to it. And that's their normal daily clothing. That's every single woman's garment, not just one or two.
Now when we move into the 1500s, so say by 1520, what is going on in fashion at that point? And why would you think of this as maternity clothing?
This is quite a different time period. You have progression from what we consider the medieval period to what we consider the Renaissance period. The very end of the 15th century into the 16th century, we have what's generally termed Tudor fashion. Typically, dresses have a structured bodice, a waist seam, and a skirt. The bodice and the skirt are sewn together, but they're separated by a waist seam, which is kind of the revolution of Renaissance fashion, is that a waist seam happens. And once you have a waist seam, you can do two things. You can make the bodice tighter without restricting the legs, and you can make the skirts incredibly big because you don't have to take that volume of fabric and fit it into the top of the body. We don't quite have anything we could call a corset yet, but there is the very earliest iteration of corsetry is called a pair of bodies. So a pair of bodies is the two halves of your bodice laced together. Anything you can lace, you can unlace. Anything you can lace tightly so the two ends come together, you can leave open, much like the stays I'm wearing today that don't fit me anymore. My stays right now are open down the back a good 4 or 5 inches, but they still work to do everything stays need to do. And that's one of the reasons that we see lacing in women's garments throughout the ages, and we don't really see lacing in men's. We see buttons in men's. We see hooks. We see permanent joins. But in women's, you always have to have this, oh, today I'm going to lace very tightly. Oh, today I'm going to leave this open because I'm uncomfortable or I've gained weight or I'm pregnant. In the Tudor period, we look at these gowns and we think, oh, that's a very stiff gown. It has a very defined bodice, and that bodice must be that size and it can't change. But one of the things that's not apparent when you're looking at a Tudor gown, there's lacing down the center front that's covered by a placket. If you left that lacing open, and there are some pictures, early Tudor pictures, where you can see the kirtle underneath is left open, and you can see the edges of the kirtle, the tops of the edges, sticking out from under the placket that's on top of them. In some portraits, you have women who only have maybe an inch, couple centimeters space. And other women, their lacing is so wide open, it's almost to their armpits. Even though they are stiffened bodices, and they're not quite boned yet, but stiffened bodices, stiffened linen, sometimes some cording to make the bodice be that kind of ice cream cone shape that we see in later centuries. It's stiff, but it's still malleable because of lacing.
Lacing is probably going to be one of the themes throughout this entire video, especially as we get into 18th and 19th century. It's all about lacing.
Another portrait is a very late 16th century portrait of an unknown woman by Marcus Garretts. She's obviously pregnant. I mean, she's got the belly bump is all the way up to her breasts. She's got basically the bottom of her bodice completely unlaced. So it's laced over her breasts. It's laced open, but it's still laced over her breast. And then it's just completely unlaced below where a modern bra strap would be. And And that's another benefit of lacing. You don't have to lace the whole thing. You lace them as far down as you need, and then you just leave them open.
The 1600s. I feel like this is kind of the century that everyone forgets about.
Oh yeah,
You ever
it's
feel
my
like
favorite
that?
century. It's my favorite
know.
century.
Say 1620 to 1720. What is going on at this point in history?
There's a real progression from the 16th century into the 17th century. In the beginning of the 17th century, women are wearing much what they were wearing at the end of the 16th. Of course, no one throws out their clothes just because the century changed.
Except the Victorians.
Except the Victorians. Because they're crazy. The 1620s, the typical dress of women of all classes, both upper class and working class women, were wearing jacket and petticoat combinations. Much like what you see working women wearing in the 18th century, both working women and noble women were wearing this in the 17th century. The waist in the 1620s wasn't empire waist, but it wasn't natural waist either. It was about halfway between. This is why no one talks about 1620s. It's a waistline that to modern eyes we think is ugly. It's a very strange place to have a waistline. And in order to have a waistline there, because your body doesn't go in there, you have to create that. And how they created it was with a boned bodice. So you had a bodice that was boned into the V shape, but then the bottom of the V stopped at your high waistline. And then below that, it was just a pleated skirt or a gored skirt. You had these tabs that made the skirt, and the skirt started at your high waist.
At this point, were they called stays or were they called pairs of bodies still?
They were called stays at this point.
They were called
You started
stays.
hearing stays. But you also, bones bodice was also something that was said. The word stays starts coming in. I'd have to look this up, but I believe that the first instance of the word stays comes in the very, very late 16th century. By the 1620s, that people were calling them stays would not be unusual. Now you have a high waistline, and you could get through many months of pregnancy with that laced completely closed because it stops before the pregnant belly. Right there again, we have this kind of return to that idea in the 15th century where a woman was beautiful because she looked pregnant. If you look at pictures of Henrietta Maria, who was the queen of Charles I of England, she's always got this high-waisted bodice. That's the waistline of the time. In common women, the waistline tends to be lower because it's more functional and they're not, exaggerating for fashion's sake. But lower class women were still wearing their waists higher than at natural waist. And again, if you've got a pregnant belly to sit your waistband on, it pushes everything up.
And what was the name of the typical dress that people wore at that point?
That's a really good question. Really, honestly, the answer for the most part is dress. When you read period references to clothing of the time period, it just uses the generic term dress because they're not calling something specific.
This is perplexing as someone, especially that wears a lot of Victorian and Georgian fashion, because it gets so insanely complex by the 18th century, as we're about to find out.
It does, because by the 18th century, you have an increase in production. The Industrial Revolution happens. So you have more opportunities to wear different styles of dress rather than wearing the same thing all the time. So you start having terminology. And as a clothing historian, historians like terms. So we want to say, and that's a guna, and that's a kirtle, and this is why it's different. When we say kirtle, we mean this kind of sleeve and this kind of closure, but they didn't. And as a historian, that's also something we have to be careful about, because historians put labels on things that the people who wore these things every day would never have used.
By the 1680s, the 1690s, I have seen quite a drastic shift in a silhouette by that point. What would you say is happening?
Yeah, by about the 1670s, I like to call it the revolution in fashion, the glorious revolution of fashion, because it happens about the same time as the glorious revolution happens in the United Kingdom. Which wasn't the United Kingdom yet, in Great Britain. You have this silhouette that becomes something very familiar to us, that ice cream cone top and the inverted ice cream cone bottom, which we started to see in the Tudor period, but we never see it as exaggerated as it's going to be in the 18th century. We start seeing the beginnings of that in the 17th century, about 1660s, 1670s. And what you've got there is a very rigidly boned set of stays and a petticoat. So women are wearing these stays and they're very long-bodied. It's a myth that women couldn't sit down. Of course women could sit down. But in very, very fashionable circles, there may have been a bit of a fashion arms race. Oh, my bodice is so long, I can't possibly sit down. This kind of competition. But that would have been very, very elite. And we don't have knowledge that that necessarily happened. The silhouette was a very long waist. So the waistline drops. And in order to make that look that way, you have to have a very long set of stays. So now, instead of having the bodice end at the waistline, you're having the bodice continue into the hips. So you're making a very smooth line. By the 1670s, you have everyone looking very tall because they have these lengthy bodices on. And then they also added to that by stacking their hair in rolls on top of their head. It's called a tour, which is the French word for tower. Also putting a veil called a mandilla on top of their head. The typical Spanish lace headdress came out of the 1670s, but they were wearing it all over Europe at that time. Exaggerated silhouette like that, it's not comfortable. Women wanted to be comfortable, and they wanted to be fashionable, but they also wanted to be comfortable. What happened was women started wearing robes that they got from the Middle and Far East. This is, the golden age of trade. This is when the Dutch were trading all over the world, and the Portuguese. And so you have them bringing back silks and spices from the Near and Far East. One of the things they brought back were robes from Asia. And these robes are very simply constructed like a T. So you had no shoulder seam. The fabric went, from the back over the front, just folded. The sleeves were not separate. They were part of the fabric. And then they closed up the front. And women started wearing these over their stays. You could receive visitors at your home, and you would have on your stays and petticoat and this robe. And that robe became the mantua. Mantua named after the city Mantua in Italy, which was a great trading port. The mantua turned into the robe anglaise, the robe française. All of those typical 18th century gowns are the evolution of the mantua. But at the beginning, the mantua was just this very plain T-shaped robe from another country that you would pleat with your hands and stick a couple pins in it, pin it to your stays so it would stay in place, and put a belt around it so your waistline would show off. In pregnancy, what do? You pin the mantua a little differently because you're a bit bigger. When you're pinning the mantua to your stays, you have this space in between the opening of your mantua. You don't want people to see your stays. I mean, maybe you do, but maybe you want them to see something more pretty than the front of your stays. So you get a beautiful piece of embroidered silk and you pin it to your stays before you pin your mantua to your stays. And that's how the stomacher was born. People are putting this piece of fabric on the front of their bodices way back in the Tudor period. We spoke about that, how they were covering up their lacing with this. The same thing happens with the stomacher. So the stomacher was sometimes set behind the lacing and you would have decorative lacing over the front of it. But sometimes the stomacher just pinned right onto your stays, and then your gown didn't have to meet in the front. You could pin the gown along the sides of the stomacher. If you were pregnant, you just pinned it further out here. And if you were not pregnant, you lost some weight, you were thinner, you just pin it closer in. You could change out these stomachers because while they were very beautiful silk and wonderfully embroidered and very decorative, they're very small. So you could have a bunch of different ones and it would make your entire outfit look different just because you had a different decorative stomacher on the front.
Now going into, say, the 1710s and 20s.
There was a garment called the mantua still in the 1720s. And it was basically the old mantua from the 1670s, but it was more sewn into shape. Whereas in the 1670s, you were putting on this robe and pleating it however you wanted it to be, and then you would unpleat it when you took it off. By the 1720s, they are permanently pleating the mantua so that when you take it off, it still has that shape. But still, it has this open bit at the front. And that open bit either closes by pinning it to your stays, pinning it to your stomacher, or it laces zigzag across the front, across your stays or stomacher. The mantua looks different, but it's still the same animal, if you see what I mean.
It's just evolving over time.
Yes, exactly.
Just like an animal.
Yeah, like an animal. And now you've got stays in this time period where, and I don't think there's a time period where you don't have them, that could have lacing in front as well as back. You hear this myth bandied about that women who had servants had backlacing stays, and women who were common women who didn't have servants had to have front lacing stays because they had to dress themselves. And this just isn't true. We have stays that are only front lacing in the collections of noble people, and we have stays that are backlacing that are clearly common people's stays. The reality is that no woman is an island. Nobody lives completely alone and can't find somebody to lace them into their stays. It's not this idea that I'm portraying a working class person. I can't have backlacing stays. You absolutely can. Matter of fact, stays that are only backlacing are far more common in the surviving record than stays that are front lacing. You tend to have front lacing stays that stay laced the same amount in front, and you adjust them in the back where no one sees it.
Yeah, much like I have a pair of stays that are based off of an extant from about the 1780s. And they've got maybe like a halfway down slit that laces up in the front and then fully laced in the back.
And you know what that slit is for? For nursing.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about maternity clothing, but we haven't touched on the fact that a woman who is pregnant eventually is going to have that baby, and then she has to be able to nurse it.
Coming into the 1740s and 50s, Rococo is starting, and these other more artistic movements. Then we're going into the middle, late part of the Georgian period. What is going on, and why is it maternity clothing? This is just the magical question we're going to keep asking.
When we look at clothing from the 1670s and the 1720s and the 1740s, 50s, 60s, 70s, we see something very radically different. But the fact of the matter is, the details are different, but the basic structure is the same. You still have a set of stays, you still have petticoats from the waist down, and you have a dress that is open in the front. And whether it's open in the front straight down the center, or it's open on the front and you pin it to your stays, or you lace it across the front of your stays, they still close the same way. One of the ways that women often close things in this time period is by the use of pins. Sometimes you have lacing across the front, but more often you have women pinning their clothing closed. And sometimes you pin it closed. You just bring the two edges together and you put pins down the front. And if you need it to be smaller, you just overlap the edges and pin down the front. So this same thing keeps happening. We don't think about using pins this way in our modern lives, but in the 18th century, you had pins like crazy. I mean, you were using pins for everything, and pins were an essential part of a woman's wardrobe. I strongly debate the use of pins in sewing. Most pins that we find are dress pins, are pins for holding your clothing together.
I guess basting would have been the norm then, just basting things together, not even pinning them.
Pinning to sew is a very, very modern idea.
So just to play devil's advocate, I wear a lot of equestrian clothing, especially 18th century riding habits and red goes, and these are all closing with buttons. Would you say that this is an exception to the rule that most women's clothing is maternity clothing?
Well, it is an exception, but it's an exception to a bigger rule. All women's riding costume is an imitation of men's dress, and more importantly, men's military dress, which always has, buttons almost as decoration. Sometimes the buttons on men's military dress aren't even functional. In 1588, there was a document called Stubbs' Anatomy of Abuses, which is basically a rant by a Puritan preacher in England who was railing against women wearing doublets like unto the men. The only time women are wearing doublets is when they're riding, because a doublet is a man's upper body garment. So women are wearing them when they're riding. And one of his complaints was that women look like little men. And that wasn't to be had. Women have to look like women, and men have to look like men, and never the twain shall meet. And this kind of complaint about women dressing as men, these complaints by conservative ministers or other people who were professional complainers, I suppose, about women wearing men's clothing, happens over and over again. So one complaint is that, they look like men, which clearly they didn't, but that was the complaint. But the other thing is that they're not being feminine. And that's all about the buttons. That's all about the military style clothing. And you can't be pregnant and wear that clothing. So therefore, you're not a proper wife. Riding a side saddle was incredibly dangerous. I mean, riding a side saddle was dangerous in the Victorian period as well, because your skirt could get caught and you could get dragged. Before then, you didn't have any place to hang your leg that crossed over the horse. So you were literally sitting sideways on a chair on the back of the horse with nothing really to hang on to. So a woman out riding is already risking herself and therefore risking her family because she is carer of her children. She's the person who runs the household. Women riding was something that was not really applauded. And women riding during pregnancy, I mean, that would have been the ultimate thumb of the nose to the establishment, because you're putting yourself in risk, and more important than you is your baby. You're out riding pregnant, I don't think you'd get out the front door. So you have this situation where, yes, absolutely, women are wearing riding costume, and riding costume has buttons and therefore isn't malleable. You can't wear a riding costume in pregnancy unless you made a completely new riding costume for every stage of pregnancy, which we don't know that anyone did that. You wouldn't be allowed to ride in pregnancy because it was so very dangerous for both you and your baby that, you know, if anyone could stop you, they would. So the idea that riding costume would have to accommodate pregnancy, it just wouldn't.
Women must have been potentially confined to being at home at a certain stage because of the fear of the risk, because the Georgians weren't stupid, but they only had as much knowledge as they did, and if they couldn't understand the science, they couldn't see the baby or see it on an ultrasound, they wouldn't have had the knowledge to be able to discern what was and wasn't safe.
In the Georgian period, they didn't know these things. So if a woman had a miscarriage, they would try to blame it on something. And if she was exercising, if she was taking a walk and she had a miscarriage, well, the next time she conceived, you don't let her go for a walk anymore. Correlation does not equal causation. So you're saying, oh, well, she went for a walk and then she lost the baby, so therefore the walk killed the baby. So now you can't go for a walk anymore. Women were confined to their house and sometimes confined to their beds for months of their pregnancy. In Georgian England, in the 18th century in the United States, the bedroom was less of a private space than it is now. If you had friends visiting you, you would often receive them in your bedroom. You would receive all of your friends in your bedroom and you would have parties in your bedroom. Women who were confined would be confined to their bed and would be sitting up in bed jackets, which are incredibly shapeless 18th century garments, but they're not allowed to get out of bed, or they're at least not allowed to leave the room, and certainly not allowed to leave the house for probably at least the last 3 months of pregnancy, if not the last 5 months of pregnancy.
So is this where the kazak and the batante and these types of gowns come into play?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, all of the jackets, all of the things that the 18th century jackets, the cassock, the robe batante, you're wearing them over stays, but they're wrappers. They're early wrappers. When you're wearing something like that, it doesn't matter what your shape is underneath it. The point is, look at this beautiful silk. Don't look at the shape that's underneath it. While women did wear cassocks and robe batantes when they weren't pregnant, certainly it was a great way to disguise a pregnancy or to cover up a pregnant belly. It's very new that it's okay to have your belly out there. So, the cassock, the robe batante, all of the bed gown, all of these rather A-line garments look the same on someone who's pregnant and someone who's not.
Now, if we go into 1790s, the waistline is starting to go back up with the whole French Revolution fashion and everything like that. And now going into as well Regency, because in a way, Regency really does start, I would say, around 1790.
It does, absolutely does. Mm-hmm.
Because that's when the fashion changes so drastically and we start to see round gowns and all these different styles. I suppose it's the higher waistline once again accommodating for pregnancy.
You can wear Regency era stays quite late into pregnancy because they don't touch your belly. They're higher. Yeah, the high waistline of the late 18th century and the early 19th century really accommodate pregnancy quite well. We still have the same thing. We have clothing that closes by laces. We have clothing that pins to stays. So the shorter waistline makes it easier for regular clothing to be pregnancy clothing. There's no maternity clothing because normal clothing does the job.
Now we're entering a period where I would say it's the most difficult to wrap our heads around how that could possibly be maternity clothing. And that's the Victorian period. Corsets were a lot longer. They definitely covered the uterus in a lot of cases. Can you talk about why you would think think that Victorian clothing is also suited for maternity?
Let's think about the Victorian period, exactly what it means. Victoria took the throne in 1838 and died in 1901. So that's a whole lot of decades. Clothing changed very radically from when she first took the throne until when she died. In the 1840s, you still have a fairly high waist. You return to that kind of weird waist that they had in the early 17th century. It wasn't high and wasn't natural. And then in the 1850s, 1860s, the waist, it's at a natural level, but it's still artificially high because you're putting a crinoline underneath it, which kind of pushes everything up. So corsets in that mid-Victorian period are shorter than corsets become in the 1880s.
They're very short. I wear mid-Victorian all the time and they are so short.
You can go quite late into pregnancy before you'd have to do anything about changing your corset. And again, leaving your corset open, those things still work. And then we start seeing corsets made for maternity now that have extra slashes in them in the bottom part of the corset that lace open. So as your belly gets bigger, you lace those pieces open. So you're still wearing a corset, but the pieces over your growing belly are allowed to become wider and wider.
Would you say that's around the 1870s when the switch is beginning to happen?
Yeah, I think 1870s, 1880s, because you're starting to get cheaper fabrics and cheaper labor, and the sewing machines invented in the 1840s, but by the 1880s, women are having them in their houses. Not that wealthy women are making their own clothing, but still, if a woman has a sewing machine in her house, she can sell her labor to women and be a dressmaker. Because the corset lengthened in the 1870s, 1880s, now you have a corset that covers your hip bones. So it's rather long. So you have to do something different because you can't wear that corset over a pregnant belly. It's not going to accommodate it. You can unlace yourself a bit in the back for the first couple months, but you can't wear it very long. So you have to wear a different corset. And then the Victorians' well-earned reputation of being a bunch of prudes, the whole idea of a woman's confinement expanded even more. It was absolutely scandalous to be seen in public with a pregnant belly. You know, a working class woman would show her belly because she had no choice, she has to work. But a woman who was not working class, a woman of the middle and upper class, would never go out and allow people to see that she was pregnant. In the Victorian period, the upper class Victorians looked on common working people almost as if they were a different species, as if they weren't human. She has a big pregnant belly, but that's just the same as my horse having a big pregnant belly.
That's so horrible.
It is really horrible, but it is the way people thought of each other in that time period. The Victorians kind of had this crazy idea about not being animals, not being mammals, being something else somehow. And I think that people before the Victorians were just more cognizant of their relationship to nature. In the Victorian period, you have the first great movement from people, the exodus from the countryside into the cities. The majority of people live in cities for the first time in history. That changes your relationship to the natural world. Think about Victorian cities. They're not lovely cities we have today that have parks and greenways and this kind of stuff. They were industrial, choked with smog. And there was this difference between the upper class and the working class. That difference was not as stark in the previous time periods. By the Victorian period, it got to be like almost two different species. And there was also a big thing in the Victorian period about how things appeared. People lived these very quiet, private lives, and they were crazy behind closed doors. But to the world, they appeared normal. And that was so important to them.
And I think that is why people spent so much money on clothing, because clothes are the ultimate way to show someone an appearance. It's literally what we put on our bodies.
In upper class women, you have regular day dresses that have buttons all the way down the front. It looks beautiful, but you can't have buttons on a body that's going to change. But if you do have buttons on a dress, like so much of Victorian fashion, it is a statement of wealth. It's saying, this dress is my size now, and if I change sizes, I will buy a new one because I can afford it. Buttons become this statement of wealth. A Victorian woman who's pregnant is not letting herself be seen. So she's still wearing the same kind of, the wrappers that you wear around your house, what you wear to the morning breakfast table. She's wearing that all the time and she's not leaving the house. And it's extraordinary to us, but that's what was happening.
It's upsetting for, for a modern day woman, definitely, because it's like, well, this sucks, that was like the reality for women back then.
Urban life was not safe. The first time in history that you had that huge concentration of people in this small area, all living in a small area, well, crime rose exponentially. And it was also dangerous to be outside in the streets. The air was horribly polluted. We have statistics that talk about the height of Londoners versus the height of people who lived in the country in England at the same time period. And the Londoners are always shorter. Wow. And the Victorians are shorter than the Tudors and the Georgians. The Victorians are the shortest people. If you were a person of wealth, you wouldn't leave the safety of your house to go out in the streets. And also it was incredibly dirty. I mean, we don't think of this, but the streets mostly weren't paved. And also people are throwing out their chamber pots into the street. So there is literally excrement that you're walking through in the street.
And horses.
And horses.
Which just makes more excrement.
Yeah, bigger excrement.
Yes.
So incredibly dirty, incredibly dangerous. So if you were a pregnant person who didn't have to leave her house, why would you? Your house is safe. And if you're wealthy, everything you need is going to come to you.
It's funny to me because I think the corset is probably the least dangerous part of the Victorian period.
Oh yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. There's so much more. There's just everything else.
Moving into dress reform, because I'm sure things are beginning to change now, and by the 1890s we get very sports specific clothing as well. How did all of this accommodate for pregnancy?
I think you have a carry-on from the Victorian period because it didn't change in the Edwardian period or the 19-teens. It was cheaper to buy clothing. It was cheaper to have clothing made for you. We're still living in a world where there's no off-the-rack clothing. There's no sized clothing. You can't just go and buy something. If you're wearing clothing that you didn't make yourself or didn't commission to have made for you, you're wearing somebody's hand-me-downs. And you can buy secondhand clothing. I mean, there's a trade in secondhand clothing is centuries old. So people who lived in the Edwardian period and the teens had access to cheaper clothing, but they also had that same ethos. The Victorian ethos didn't go away. They still had the same idea that a pregnant woman shouldn't be seen in public. Their everyday clothing wasn't as accommodating to pregnancy as the clothing of the Georgians and the Tudors and the Stuarts. Working class women are still wearing that stuff that pins down the front, that laces, that ties on the side, that will accommodate different sizes, that you can hand it down to your daughter who's much smaller than you, or you can give it to your sister who's much bigger than you. And it'll work for, not just people in different stages of pregnancy, but people who are different sizes.
To end on the final decade
of
our little thing.
The 1920s, yay, 1920s.
So that waistline.
Oh,
there's no waistline is made for pregnancy.
Yeah, there's no waistline. I've had so many women say to me, "Oh, I can't wear 20s fashions because I'm not that skinny." And like, why do you think everyone in the 1920s was skinny? Because I can show you pictures of women who definitely aren't skinny in the 1920s. I have a couple of extant patterns that we reproduced, our company, and the bust measurement of these patterns is 52 inches. The big difference in silhouette in the 1920s is there is no waist. The clothing doesn't go in at your natural waist. It doesn't go in at empire waist. It doesn't go in at a high waist. It just drops from your bust line to your hip line. Patterns from the 1920s don't even have a waist measurement. So you could be a pregnant woman and wear a 1920s dress. Undoubtedly, women in the 1920s much more liberated than the previous decades, but they still had that idea of you shouldn't show off a pregnant belly. So once their dresses got tight enough that it showed, they would wear bigger dresses. From there, you get real maternity specific clothing in every day. But in the 1920s, you just didn't need it because your dress would cover it anyway.
And I guess that the real maternity clothing correlates with rack clothing. As in clothing that is pre-sized.
Pre-sized clothing is something that comes in the 1920s, 1930s.
Well, this has been thoroughly fascinating. Thank you so much, Kass, for sitting down. And just to let everyone know, we're going to continue these 500 years of series progressively throughout the upcoming months and years and such. That way we can talk about some more topics and see how they've evolved over 500 years.
I'm very excited about the next one we're going to do. It was such a wonderful idea you had, and I'm so happy that you asked me to participate with you because I'm having a great deal of fun. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much too, Kass.
Sure.